For the last 100 years, the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, has used the conflicting energies of capitalism and violent religion. But can they do it forever? There's a schizophrenia at the heart of the Saudi kingdom. How do the Saudis have such a repressive, backward-looking, and regressive state religion while still being one of the drivers of the world's economy, with the royal family that practice polygamy and doesn't let women drive cars? Well, that's recently changed, but yet educates their children at Cambridge and is deeply engaged with technology, cultures, and investment all around the world, and in fact is trying to upgrade the country with this massive, bizarre building project you may have heard of, the Line and other projects. It's a country that had legal slavery until 1962, and right now allows what some people say is a de facto slavery of foreign workers, and it often charges women with the crime of being graped, as we say on YouTube. That's right. A woman might get graped and be charged with the crime of causing that to happen. America's #1 Arab ally also executes people by public beheading for crimes such as witchcraft. This goes on right now. About 10 years ago, in July of 2013, the European Parliament identified Wahhabism as the main source of global terrorism. Well, Wahhabism is the sect of Islam, which is the official state religion of Saudi Arabia. So because Saudi Arabia has been the country with all the money, they've been the one building the mosques and the schools around the world and printing up the Qurans and the specific, I think there's things that supplement the Quran, which are later religious writings. These all come from Wahhabism. So Saudi Arabia's money is really to blame for the rise of radical Islam. ISIS were Wahhabis. So think about that, the dual nature of this country that on the one hand provides the literal fuel of the global economy with being, and this is where people think Islam is this religion of violence, is really Wahhabism, which is promoting all this terror, and that's specifically the state religion of Saudi Arabia. And of course, now we know that, well, per the lawsuit and that videotape that just came out, that at least part of the Saudi government itself was helping the hijackers on 9/11. And I think many of us always thought, gee, what a coinky-dink. 19 of the 21 hijackers came from our closest Arab ally, but it was just a coincidence. So what is Wahhabism, and what does it mean to Saudi Arabia and its place in the world today? Wahhabism was founded in the late 1700s as a radical reform movement in Arabia. So you could think of Wahhabism as being to Islam as Calvinism, an extremely ascetic branch of Protestant thought is to Christianity. So time passes, and the Wahhabis align themselves with the local leader named Mohammed bin Saud. This is in the 1800s, who was in the process of taking over the Arabian Peninsula the old-fashioned way by invading and killing native. The Wahhabis aligned themselves with local leader Mohammed bin Saud, who was in the process of taking over the Arabian Peninsula the old-fashioned way by invading and killing neighboring tribes. The team of the House of Saud and the Wahhabis were known for massacring the male populations and enslaving the women and children of their rivals. Yes, this is the same House of Saud we're allies with, and the same House of Saud that had Adnan Khashoggi chopped up some years back. Strict Wahhabist doctrine believes no reverence should be paid to historic and religious buildings. They don't respect history at all. It's very different from Western culture. Time effectively stopped with the writing of the Quran and the death of Muhammad, and any technologies or religious thought created after the prophet's death are tools of the devil. Wow, so history ended with the death of Muhammad. So we're living in, I guess, the paradise, and you either conform to it or not. That's the official religion of our ally, Saudi Arabia. By 1901, Ibn Saud, leader of the House of Saud, starts to complete the military conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. At the same time, his Wahhabi religious partners are in the midst of a campaign to corral the many Bedouin Arab nomads that still make up the majority of Arabia's population. Remember, Arabia is that whole peninsula, which is Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, maybe there's something else too. This was done because the Wahhabi felt that true Islam couldn't be practiced out in the great empty waste of the Arabian desert. So you have this big, vast space where you have these nomadic groups moving around. They're Islamic, they're Muslim, because the year it's 1901. They've been Islamic for 1,300 years. But because they're out in these open spaces, they're not near religious control. So the Wahhabis want all the Bedouin tribesmen, and remember, Arabia was maybe the most backward, least contacted. It was like an Amazon. Imagine if the Amazonian tribes suddenly became very important to the global economy. That's how cut off from the rest of the world the Arabian Great Empty was. So the Wahhabis wanted the Bedouins to come in, to be near the whatever cities they were, maybe the coasts and the oasis little towns, and the coming in of the Bedouin was a great opportunity for Ibn Saud. He's trying to build his empire. These nomads from the desert lived a life of raiding and fighting. They were full of religious vigor from their recent conversion to Wahhabism, and King Saud formed many of these Bedouins into a military force called the Ikhwan to help him finish off the conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. So these new converts to Wahhabism, they're rough and tumble people. They've been living out on their own in the desert. They come in to the oasis, to the towns. They're under Wahhabist religious control, and the Wahhabis' political ally, Ibn Saud, forms all these recent converts. This is the idea where if you guys are into Dune, the Fremen, think of the Fremen from Dune. That's who the Arabian Wahhabists were. They come in, Saud forms into a militia called the Ikhwan, and with the Ikhwan at his side, King Saud swiftly subdued most of the Arabian Peninsula. He seized the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. During the House of Saud and the Ikhwan's campaign of conquest, they performed tens of thousands of executions and possibly hundreds of thousands of public amputations upon their defeated enemies. This is the late 1800s, going into 1900. Does this remind you of anything? The Ikhwan were pretty similar to ISIS, which the world just all came together to destroy for the most part. Everybody agreed to get rid of ISIS, and the founders of the Saudi Arabian kingdom used a group and tactics that are really exactly like ISIS to forge their empire in the Arabian Peninsula. Again, our current ally. Now, the Ikhwan proved difficult to control even for their allies, the House of Saud. The Bedouin converts wanted to spread their radical Wahhabism into the British-controlled regions that are now Jordan, Kuwait, and Iraq. They considered Sunni and Shiite Muslims to, in fact, not even be Muslim. They're idolaters. It's Wahhabism or nothing. So the House of Saud by this time had it's about 1901. The House of Saud has some diplomatic ties with the British, and they were keeping the Ikhwan, who felt it was their duty to bring true Islam into the Jordanian Protectorate and whatever it was called that the British controlled, that are now the countries of Jordan and Kuwait. So Ibn Saud, who's got these early ties with the British, he keeps the Ikhwan pulled back. Now they revolt, some of them revolt. And Saud had to go to war with his own Ikhwan warriors. And he finally crushed him in 1929, and with that, he had succeeded in three ways. One, he had control of almost the entire Arabian Peninsula. Two, he had destroyed his internal rivals for power. And three, he had diplomatic recognition and support of the British Empire. The Ikhwan that stayed loyal to the Saudis were folded into a new military force. It became the modern National Guard of Saudi Arabia, and Wahhabism continued its role as official state religion. Fast forward, the year is 1938, and black gold, Texas tea, that is. Fast forward, the year is 1938, and black gold, Texas tea, oil that is, up from the ground comes a bubbling crude, and oil is found in King Ibn Saud's land, and everything changes. Turns out, in fact, that at the time the kingdom is sitting on, well, at the time it was the biggest load of oil in the world. I think like maybe Venezuela and some other places have more than Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is so rich and their oil so valuable because theirs is the most easily extracted. So you may have heard of shale oil and stuff in the United States, which is somewhat expensive to get. It's kind of dry oil that's in rock that has to be taken out. Different oil is at different depths. Of course, the deeper it is, the more it's costly it is to pull out. What is the type of earth you have to move out of the way? Well, literally, Saudi Arabia, a lot of their oil wells, you just drill in the ground, and there's these massive underground oil fields that are very easy. So Saudi Arabia drives the world price. The king's biggest source of revenue before then had been taxing travelers making the Hajj to Mecca, but once oil discovered, things changed quickly. In fact, nowadays, Saudi Arabia covers the cost of people coming for the Hajj for the most part. A consortium of U.S. oil producers with ties to the famous U.S. families we all know, the Bushes and etc., form a giant company called Aramco, and by 1950, the kingdom is 50-50 profits, 50-50 partners on oil profits with their American partners in Aramco. So you see the tight interlocking of the Texas oil families, U.S. bankers, and the Saudi economy and the Saudi royal family. Lots of money has been being made now for nearly, 100 years, 90 years. So by the late 1950s, the kingdom built by King Ibn Saud through desert conquest is now a key cog in the modern global capitalist system, and it's quickly reaping the economic benefits. More than half of Saudi Arabia's population was still considered semi-nomadic Bedouins in the 50s, but as the oil economy boomed, these desert nomads, almost all, came in from the desert to the cities and oil fields to work and live. Radical Wahhabist Islam seemingly took a backseat to modernization and economic development. Saudi Arabia quickly moved into the ranks of the world's most important economies. Now, during the Cold War period, another axis of power was forming in the Arab world, not religious but political. Socialism and pan-Arab nationalism. It remains in what's called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very powerful in Egypt and a few other places, and the now extinct Ba'ath Party. Saddam Hussein came up in the Ba'ath Party. This axis of power, should we say, in the Arab world was supported by the Soviet Union to some degree, which, of course, at that time was America's primary global strategic rival. Perhaps Russia still is. And the Soviets provided massive military and economic support to Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Iraq, which lasted into the 80s when the Soviet Union didn't stop lasting itself. In 1973, Egypt, the most powerful state in the Arab world at the time, led its Soviet-backed coalition, which included Syria and Jordan, into a second war against Israel. Israel dominated militarily and embarrassed the Arab world for a second time in less than a decade. Egypt had led a similar invasion in 1967 that ended in such a quick disaster it was dubbed the Six-Day War. So 73 was the chance for Saudi Arabia to take the reins, since Egypt and its underling states had been embarrassed, had been humbled. And as the world's biggest oil producer, Saudi Arabia led OPEC into a massive raise on petroleum prices, forcing the U.S. to pressure Israel into relatively easy peace terms for the Arabs. The Arab world had a new leader, and Saudi Arabia saw its income grow massively, while the American economy was battered. So, let me walk you through that. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, they try to invade Israel. They lose very badly. Saudi Arabia sees its chance to kind of overtake Egypt as the political and philosophical and spiritual leader of the Arab world by saying, hey, we're going to do you a favor, fellow Arab states. We're going to put pressure on the U.S., which is the only country that can pressure Israel into giving you good peace terms for this disastrous war you started. We're going to pressure the United States by raising oil prices. So, for those of you old enough, or if you ever heard your parents talk about it, mid-70s, gas prices shot through the roof almost overnight because of Saudi Arabia made a decision. The United States economy changed forever. We went into a recession, but also the whole structure of the economy changed. Oil and gas would never be so cheap again. And Saudi Arabia had shown it could throw its weight around at will and impact the global economy by simply deciding to turn on or off the spigots of the oil drills. In 1979/80, two very important things happened that changed Saudi Arabia's place in the world. One was the Iranian Revolution, and the other was the collapse of oil prices. High oil prices from that time where they raised them in 73, 74, throughout the 70s led to decreased demand. That's when Japanese cars, they were better gas mileage, started getting popular. The U.S. companies stopped making the big gas guzzlers. So prices of gas, because there was less demand for it and overproduction, started to fall. So Saudi Arabia's great growth starts to pull back a little bit, and just as importantly, or even more so, the radicalization of Iran. So remember, Ayatollah Khomeini overthrows the Shah. Iran becomes a radical Islamic state. We back Iraq in a war against Iran, but it's another story. So religious fervor is flowing throughout the Middle East, and it goes to Saudi Arabia. And remember, the Wahhabists had kind of been taking a back seat since the 50s because the country was growing so fast. The bin Laden family, bin Laden's father became a multi-billionaire because he was I think he might have been the biggest construction company for the House of Saud. He was building a lot of the infrastructure during that time. But anyways, so religious fervor hits Saudi Arabia like it's in Iran, and in 1979, Wahhabists, led by a would-be messiah, attacked the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So the place where all the Muslims go to make their Hajj was attacked by people within Saudi Arabia. They wanted to overthrow the House of Saud, which they considered to be corrupt and westernized. It took the military 2 weeks to take back control. Hundreds of people were killed. The guy attempting to do this called himself the Mahdi. While the Mahdi and over 60 of his followers were publicly beheaded, the Grand Mosque attack and the events in Iran had a powerful effect on Saudi Arabia. So to appease the Wahhabist element in the country, the strong Wahhabist element, the kingdom began officially a return to strict Islam in the public space. Many of the restrictive aspects of Saudi society we've heard about, especially against women, like not being able to drive and the hijab, it didn't come into being until about 1980. That's not a leftover custom. They had left those customs in the desert, but because of the Wahhabist attack in 1980, the Wahhabis, the Mahdi and his Wahhabi followers had a big impact because they caused an increase in restrictive conservative Islamic values being imposed by law. Another way the Saudis appeased the Wahhabis in the kingdom was so-called Petro-Islam. Since Saudi Arabia is the site of Mecca, Islam's holiest city, and every year millions of Muslims from around the world make the religious pilgrimage to Mecca known as the Hajj, the Saudi government began providing such amenities as air-conditioned tents for the Muslim visitors from around the world. Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with making religious pilgrims to your country more comfortable, but it was also a conscious move to build loyalty toward the Saudi government and by extension to the Wahhabist version of Islam. So right at the heart of the most economically powerful country in the world, in the Arab world, is this schizophrenia, with Saudi Arabia simultaneously being very, very connected to the global economy, to America and Europe, very obviously un-Islamic places, and definitely not in line with Wahhabism, yet you have this fundamentalist religious principles being imposed in the public space by the government. Now, the religious power structure has had to make very profound exceptions to the basic principles of Wahhabism to keep the oil money flowing, like allowing modern technology, a little bit of alcohol in certain places, etc. In return, Wahhabi clerics get the funding to spread their message of austere radical Islam around the world using oil profits. This is known as Petro-Islam. So, we're Wahhabists in this country. We don't really like what the government is doing, the House of Saud. They're too westernized. But they are imposing the things we want on the population, even though the royals don't really follow those rules themselves. And they're giving us the money to indoctrinate all the pilgrims who make the Hajj with Wahhabism. And also, we're building mosques, we're building schools, we're donating money, we're giving away Qurans around the world as part of Petro-Islam. Wahhabism spread by the Western money that was used to buy oil. Since the late 70s, the Saudi Ministry for Religious Affairs has printed and distributed tens of millions of Qurans, maybe 100 million by now, along with school textbooks promoting Wahhabi interpretations of Islam, and mosques throughout the world, from the slums of Lagos to the rice paddies of Indonesia and the high-rise public housing projects of Paris. These same books are distributed, all paid for by Saudi Arabian petrodollars. There's more than 1,500 mosques built around the world just between 75 to 2000. So that's 25 years have passed since then, by Saudi public funds. And these mosques are the initial source. A lot of these violent radicals that did terrorist things around the world were educated or attended these mosques built between 75 and 2000 by Saudi Arabian money. About a third of Saudi Arabia's population are non-citizens. Most of them are guest workers. About a third of Saudi Arabia's population are non-citizens, most of them guest workers who work for very low wages. They live in substandard housing. They're often treated like de facto slaves, both by the employers and the government. I think if you visit there, even as a visitor, you have to give, I know in Kuwait, there's going to go, you got to give somebody, a Kuwaiti citizen, your passport, and they hold it. I think in Saudi Arabia, I'm pretty sure those guest workers, their boss holds their passport. They can't leave when they want to. So it's easy to see how the guest workers in the rich Gulf states return to their poor homelands. They've been indoctrinated by Wahhabism. They've been strictly controlled by their bosses, and they take the Wahhabist religious habits of their former employers, perhaps seeing a connection between the austere religiosity, the strict control of women, and the vast wealth of Saudis with the religious habits. They take them back home. Now, to me, I think Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, by the royals at least, is a performance art. Pays homage to an imaginary past tightly controlled by the Saudi royal family and government, who are totally interconnected with the world and with capitalism and technology, which is the total antithesis of what Wahhabism really is. So, what's going to happen? Can Wahhabism and the House of Saud coexist? And what does it mean if they don't? Remember that I said under the Wahhabist doctrine, history stopped with the death of the Prophet. So we've been given the Quran. It contains everything we need to know. And the Prophet has told us everything we need to know. There is no history. So technology changes how we live. Technology is the antithesis of that idea. So I'm afraid personally that some internal battle. Remember, the Saudis are paying for a war in Yemen right now. Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting kind of a proxy war for who's going to be the most powerful influence in the Middle East. And then, of course, we have what's going on in Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas. That's a whole nother thing. But in the looking forward, I'm worried about Saudi Arabia being unstable. And Saudi Arabia has been spending 10% of its output, its GDP, on military. The United States, which is the biggest military in the world by far, we only spend 3.5%. Now, of course, we're a much bigger economy, but this is a militarized country. So imagine $1 out of $10 in Saudi Arabia is going to the military. They've been the number one customer of U.S. military goods since the 1950s. The incestuous relationship, the U.S. military and Saudi Arabia, U.S. military suppliers, and of course oil. It's all the stuff you think of in the conspiracy theories. I mean, it's right there. Oil and guns between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So, of course, our intelligence apparatus, I mean, I'm not proposing that we knew that Saudi Arabia was going to do 9/11, but if we found out, we certainly would have covered it up, which appears to be, at least to some extent, what's happened. So here's a breakdown of the political and religious basics of Saudi Arabia, the country right now. It looks like they may have been, at least in part, the state sponsor of the 9/11 attacks on these United States of America, Al Prophet.